He was the last who remembered fire. He was the last who remembered chains. He was the last who remembered the silence of those who could not speak, their tongues cut away, their spirits nailed into the dust of forgotten moons. He walked among ruins, and the ruins whispered back, not with voices of the living, not with voices of the dead, but with the hollow hymns of stone and the creak of iron where slaves once wept. Without sound, the Imperium was vast. The Imperium was holy. The Imperium was merciless, and, in its endless vaults of flesh, there were those who were neither alive nor dead. They were labor. They were silence. They were shadow. They were the hands that raised the cathedrals, yet they would never kneel within them. They were the nameless multitude. They were the unremembered. They were the chained, and this was their scripture, though no priest would carry it. The chronicles of lords are carved in adamant. The chronicles of saints are painted in gold, but the chronicles of slaves are written in marrow, burned into the ash of furnaces, and scattered in the breath of dying men. No one recites their songs, no one engraves their names, and yet the stars are full of their echoes. For the Imperium was never carried by the mighty alone, it was carried by the backs that bent, by the blood that fell unseen, by the tears that dried before they struck the soil. This is the memory that drifts through me now. I do not speak as a victor. I do not speak as a saint. I speak as ash, as ruin, as one who saw the chains, but could not break them. Once there was a world. It was not glorious. It was not sacred. It was a quarry for the great machines of the Imperium. Its skies were never blue. They were blackened with soot, veiled with the incense of unending labor. Its seas were not seas, but poisoned basins, choked with the runoff of factories older than memory. The people of that world did not live. They endured. Their flesh was spent like coal. Their children were spent like oil. Their breath was the currency by which the Imperium paid for its wars, and in the silence of their endurance, their cries went upward to a god who did not answer. It is said, the God Emperor sits upon the golden throne. It is said, his light pierces the void. It is said he sees all. Then why did he not see them? Why did he not hear the countless who died nameless, who raised his cathedrals with broken bones, who fueled his fleets with their own extinguished lives? Perhaps he did see, perhaps he did hear, and perhaps the silence was his decree. For in the Imperium, silence is a form of worship, and in slavery, silence is eternal. The chains were not only iron, they were ritual, they were doctrine, they were faith itself, twisted into shackles that no mortal could cast away. The slave prayed while he bled. The slave sang hymns while he was whipped. The slave thanked the God Emperor for each lash, for each stone lifted, for each night spent in the cold shadow of labor. For he was told that his suffering was holy. He was told that his blood was tithe. He was told that pain was the proof of loyalty, and so he bore it. And so he was unmade, and so he disappeared, swallowed by the machine of faith that does not forgive, but memory lingers, even in silence. Memory lingers. It clings to ruins. It clings to chains. It clings to the ashes where flesh once burned. I walk among those ruins, and I remember because I cannot forget. Slavery was not an accident. It was a design. It was not hidden. It was exalted. The Imperium thrives on sacrifice, but not all sacrifice is equal. Some die with banners in their hands. Some die beneath stained glass, their names sunk for 10,000 years. But the slave dies faceless, and his death is a prayer no one hears. In the dark manufactoria, where gears screamed louder than any voice, they labored. Their bodies were bent in half. Their eyes grew blind from the smoke. Their skin grew black with the dust of engines, and still they worked, and still they were forgotten, and still the Imperium called them blessed. There is no glory in chains. There is only silence, but silence can also be scripture, and this is why I speak, not as one who was free, not as one who was remembered, but as one who was bound. I will tell their story, not as victory, not as redemption, but as memory. For memory is the only chain the Imperium cannot break. Thus begins the sacred telling, the story of those who bore the weight of empires, the story of those who were sacrificed in silence, the story of those who raised the pure Imperium with their bones, the story of slaves in the darkness of eternity. They are gone, but I will remember. The world was not yet broken. Its skies still carried light, though veiled in smoke. Its rivers still ran, though red with ore. Its mountains still stood, though carved into wounds by drills that never slept. And the people still bowed their heads in reverence, believing that what they gave was not stolen, but sanctified. They did not see the blade above them. They did not feel the weight tightening around their throats. They only saw banners in the heavens, shimmering with the wings of the Aquila, and they whispered, "It is good." The priests came with incense. The overseers came with chains. The soldiers came with guns. Each carried the voice of the Imperium, though none spoke with mercy. The priests promised eternity. The overseers demanded obedience. The soldiers enforced silence. Together they were the Trinity of power. Together they were the mask of glory. Together they made the chains invisible, and the people believed. In those days, the cathedrals of the Imperium rose like mountains of stone. Every brick was carved by hand. Every arch was lifted with blood. Every spire was paid for with the marrow of men. The faithful stood in awe. They said, "Behold, the Emperor's house." They said, "Behold, the triumph of mankind." They said, "Behold, our offering to eternity." And they did not see their fathers dying in the scaffolds. They did not see their mothers breaking beneath sacks of mortar. They did not see their children swallowed in pits where the stones collapsed. They saw only beauty, and beauty was enough to blind them. The manufactoria were no less holy, so the priests declared. For each weapon forged was a hymn, each shell cast was a prayer, each tank born in the smoke was a shrine upon treads, and so the labor was exalted. The labor was sanctified. The labor was made into scripture. The men and women who toiled did not call themselves slaves. They called themselves pilgrims. They called themselves offerings. They called themselves chosen. For the ecclesiarchy whispered to them, "To labor without rest is the highest devotion. To shed your blood is to write your name in heaven. To die at the anvil is to be reborn at his side." And so they labored, and so they bled, and so they died nameless in the great parades of victory. When the banners unfurled and the cannons fired, the faithful cheered, but not for themselves. They cheered for lords who would never see their faces. They cheered for generals who had never stepped into the mines. They cheered for saints whose bodies were carried in reliquaries of gold. The faithful cheered because they believed. They believed the victories were theirs. They believed the triumphs belonged to all. They believed they were more than hands and backs. But belief does not change chains. Belief does not fill the belly. Belief does not heal broken bones. Still, they believed glory was heavy, but it was not shared. It sat upon their shoulders like a cathedral half-built. It sat upon their lungs like the smoke of endless forges. It sat upon their eyes until they could no longer see the truth. Yet in that blindness, there was a strange light, a light that made the dust shimmer, a light that made the sweat seem holy, a light that made suffering look like salvation, and in that light, they carried on, day after day, stone after stone, chain after chain. The world sang with labor. The hammers struck like drums. The gears shrieked like choirs. The voices of slaves rose in hymns that were not theirs. And the Imperium called it beautiful. And the Imperium called it glory. And the Imperium called it eternal. But within the bones of that glory, there was rot. For glory that feeds on silence is not true. Glory that feeds on flesh is not holy. Glory that feeds on slavery is already ash, waiting for the wind. I saw them kneel at the foot of statues they had carved with their own hands. The saints of the Imperium towered above them, cold and perfect in marble. The slaves bent their knees and pressed their brows into the dust, and whispered prayers to statues that would never weep for them. The overseers watched, the priests blessed. The soldiers stood with weapons ready, and still the people believed, for belief is the strongest chain of all. The banners burned, the hymns fell silent. The chains did not break, but they grew heavier. As war came upon the world like a shadow without end, it began not with thunder, but with silence. The silence of supply lines broken, the silence of promises unkept, the silence of priests who did not return, and then the fire followed. The heavens cracked with bombardment. The manufactoria trembled. The cathedrals split, their spires shattering into dust. The statues of saints toppled, their marble faces buried in rubble. The slaves looked upward. They saw the sky burning. They saw the banners fall. They saw the light turn red dot, and they understood. The glory was never theirs. The glory was never real. The glory was only another chain. The overseers fled first. Their voices, once filled with command, became screams. They abandoned the quarries, the mines, the factories. The priests followed after. The ones who had preached of eternity clutched relics of gold and ran for ships that would not wait. And the soldiers did not flee. They turned their guns inward. For when war comes, the Imperium does not waste ammunition on mercy. It silences the weak. It silences the nameless. It silences the chains that might break. And so the slaves were herded, not into safety, but into death. Their bodies were stacked to build walls. Their backs were broken to bear ammunition. Their lives were poured into trenches, a currency cheaper than steel. The hymns did not rise anymore, only cries, and even the cries were brief. For in the fire of war, there is no room for lamentation, only silence remains. I remember a face, not a name. There were no names, only faces, like sparks in a storm, briefly lit before the dark consumed them. He did not scream when the fire took his sight. He did not curse when the overseer's lash struck him one final time. He only whispered a prayer, not to the emperor, not to the saints, but to the dust beneath his knees. The dust was all he had left, and then he was gone. The war did not unmake the Imperium. The Imperium endured, as it always does, feeding on the endless flesh of its people. The war unmade the slaves, for faith cannot stand when faith is devoured. Belief cannot stand when belief is drowned in fire. Chains cannot hold when the hands that wear them are ashes. What remained was not devotion. What remained was not loyalty. What remained was silence, and silence is heavier than iron. The manufactoria burned, the mines collapsed, the cathedrals fell into dust, but the chains remained. Always, the chains remained. Even in ruin, they clung to the bones of the dead. Even in fire, they glowed red and unbroken. Even in silence, they sang the hymn of bondage. The slaves became shadows. No banners, no hymns, no prayers, only shadows in the ruins, drifting through smoke, searching for water, searching for bread, searching for an end. But there was no end, only the war. The Imperium called it sacrifice. The priests who fled called it holy. The soldiers who survived called it necessity. But those who bore it, they had no word, for their tongues were gone, for their voices were gone, for their hope was gone. The sky cracked, the silence came, and still the chains did not break. The soldiers stood with weapons ready, and still the people believed, for belief is the strongest chain of all. The fire had passed. The banners were ash. The cathedrals were broken teeth, gnawing at the sky. But the chains remained. They always remained, and in their weight, the slaves were judged. They knelt before altars that no longer stood. They whispered prayers into the dust. But the altars did not answer. The saints did not stir. The God Emperor did not descend. Their faith had been a chain. Now it was a noose. One by one, the people learned the truth. Not through revelation, not through prophecy, through silence, through the silence of a God who did not weep, through the silence of priests who did not return, through the silence of brothers who never rose from the ashes. And in that silence, they understood they were never chosen. They were never beloved. They were never remembered. They were fuel. They were dust. They were nothing, but even nothing can burn. Even nothing can scream. Even nothing can be sacrificed. And so their judgment came. The overseers who survived the fire gathered the remnants. They had no bread. They had no water. They had only war. And they demanded of the slaves, give more. Give blood for the trenches. Give bones for the barricades. Give children for the mines that still bled ore. And the slaves obeyed, not out of faith, not out of loyalty, but because chains do not ask for belief. Chains only ask for silence. There was no redemption. There was no glory. There was only sacrifice without end. A sacrifice no one saw. A sacrifice no one named. A sacrifice that vanished into the maw of the Emperor. I remember one who knelt. His hands were shattered. His back was broken. He had carried stone until his bones cracked. He knelt before a broken altar, and he prayed, not for salvation, not for deliverance, not even for memory. He prayed for silence. He prayed for an end. The altar did not answer. The altar was dust, but still he knelt until he too became dust. There was no judgment from above. There was no God to weigh their worth. The only judgment was the chain. And the chain decreed, you are nothing. Some whispered that their suffering would be remembered, that the Emperor himself saw them in his eternal light, that the sacrifice of nameless flesh was as holy as the blood of saints. But no scripture was written, no song was sung, no monument was raised. Their memory was ash upon ash. Their judgment was silence upon silence. It was not forgiveness they received. It was not even condemnation. It was absence. The absence of God. The absence of mercy. The absence of meaning. This was their sacrifice. To be consumed utterly and to leave behind nothing but the echo of chains. The war unmade their bodies. The silence unmade their faith. The chains unmade their names. And in that unmaking, the Imperium endured, not because of them, but because without them, there would always be another world, always another people, always another sacrifice. For the Imperium does not die. The Imperium only consumes, and the slaves were consumed. He was not forgiven. He was not remembered. He was not even cursed. He was nothing, and yet, even nothing lingers. In the dust, in the silence, in the chains that still rust in forgotten ruins. Nothing lingers, and it waits. The war ended. The banners did not rise again. The cathedrals were not rebuilt. The manufactoria lay silent, but silence is not empty. Silence remembers, and in the silence, the chains still spoke. No one speaks of them now. The records do not hold their names. The priests do not preach their sacrifice. The generals do not carve their victories into marble. They are gone, erased, unwritten yet. The ruins whisper, the stones remember. The ashes glow faintly, as if unwilling to surrender. A child walks across the broken quarry. He sees only dust, but beneath his feet are bones ground into powder. He does not know their names. He does not know their suffering, but he breathes their memory with every step, for memory does not die. It drifts, it clings, it waits. The Imperium does not tell these stories. It cannot. For to admit the truth of chains is to admit the rot in its glory. To admit the silence of slaves is to admit the weakness of its saints, and so the silence is doubled, the silence of the dead, the silence of the living who will not remember them. But silence is never perfect. Silence breaks. It cracks in the wind. It hums in the stone. It lingers in forgotten hymns, sung not for faith, but for survival. The silence carries an echo. The echo carries a myth. The myth does not speak of saints. The myth does not praise lords. The myth does not bless the Imperium. It speaks of broken hands. It speaks of bent backs. It speaks of chains that outlasted banners. It speaks of men and women who raised the Imperium with their bones. The priests call it heresy. The soldiers call it treason. The overseers call it madness. But the ruins call it truth. For what is myth, if not memory, clothed in shadow? What is echo, if not truth spoken by stone? What is silence, if not a scripture too terrible to recite aloud? I walk through the ruins still. The chains lie rusted. The altars lie broken. The air is heavy with dust, and I hear them, not in words, not in songs, but in the weight of absence. Absence that crushes like a cathedral fallen. Absence that burns like a forge extinguished. Absence that does not fade, for absence is eternal. This is their immortality, not sainthood, not remembrance, not glory. Their immortality is silence. Their immortality is erasure. Their immortality is the chain that still lies in the dust, refusing to vanish. The Imperium endures. It always endures. Not because of saints, not because of lords, but because of them, the nameless, the forgotten, the chained. And though no one speaks of them, though their names are not carved into marble, though their hymns are not sung in the grand cathedrals, still they endure, for endurance itself was their only gift. I have spoken their story, not as glory, not as victory, not as redemption, but as echo, but as myth, but as silence that refuses to die. He is gone. She is gone. They are all gone. And yet, the war is not over. For as long as chains remain, as long as silence endures, as long as the Imperium devours its children, the war is never over. Thus ends the telling, not in triumph, not in peace, only in silence that still burns. The slaves are dust, but the dust remembers, and the dust will outlast the banners, the cathedrals, even the saints. The Imperium endures, but so does the echo. Nothing remains. The forges are cold. The cathedrals stand hollow. The chains lie buried under dust. The world turns, but they are gone. And yet, the ashes breathe. The ashes breathe because memory is not bound to flesh. It lingers in the air. It drifts in the stone. It lives in the cracks of ruins, where no priest dares to look. The ashes breathe because silence is not death. Silence is a wound that does not close. Silence is a scar that bleeds, even when forgotten. The Imperium still feeds on silence. It builds its wars upon it. It builds its saints upon it. It builds its eternity upon it. But eternity is fragile. Eternity is brittle. Eternity rests upon the bones of the nameless, and bones, even when ground to dust, still whisper. You cannot burn silence. You cannot chain ashes. You cannot kill what has already been erased. This is their last vengeance. Not swords, not rebellions, not victory, but endurance. The endurance of memory without memory. The endurance of ashes that still glow. The endurance of silence that becomes heavier with every passing century. The slaves are forgotten, but forgetting is not emptiness. Forgetting is weight. Forgetting is gravity. Forgetting pulls all things down, until even saints cannot stand. I see the future. 1 billion years from now, the banners of the Imperium will be torn. The cathedrals will be ruins. The forges will be dust. but the silence will remain. The ashes will remain. The memory of chains will remain, not as words, not as myth, but as weight that bends eternity itself. Perhaps that is salvation. Not freedom, not glory, not sainthood, but the knowledge that even when all is erased, even when no one remembers their names, still the silence will outlast the empire. Still the ashes will whisper. Still the dust will remember. I end my telling here, not with triumph, not with hope, not with despair, only with ashes, only with silence, only with the weight that endures. Thus the scripture closes. The Imperium stands, but it stands upon bones. The saints shine, but they shine upon ashes. The future comes, but the silence waits to meet it. This is not ending. This is not beginning. This is the eternal after of chains. Asterisk, he was the last who remembered chains. He was the last who spoke of silence. He was the last who knelt before a broken God and still prayed. No banners flew, no songs remained, only the weight of memory pressed into the dust of worlds forgotten. The stars themselves grew pale. The heavens dimmed, as though ashamed of what they had witnessed. And in the hollows of forgotten cathedrals, where slaves once sang hymns with bleeding tongues, only echoes stirred. They were not the echoes of joy. They were not the echoes of triumph. They were the echoes of weeping shackles. Chains rattled, though no hand moved them. Censers swung, though no priest lived to guide them. The liturgy of bondage endured, carried not by breath, but by stone. The chroniclers had fallen silent. Their scrolls had burned. Their ink had run dry. Yet still, the story persisted. It persisted in scars, carved into flesh, long dead. It persisted in the bones of those buried nameless beneath fortress walls. It persisted in the void, in the silence, in the weight of all that had been lost. He was not remembered by name, but the chains remembered, and that was enough. The slaves of old did not rise again. They were not redeemed. Their suffering was not undone. There was no salvation written for them in the stars, but their memory endured, because pain is a scripture that cannot be erased. The lords who once feasted upon their toil are dust. The empires they built are ash. The thrones they carved from the bones of the broken lie toppled in ruin, and yet the sorrow of their victims lingers, heavier than the weight of stone. The forgotten one, he who bore witness, walked through the ruins. He was neither alive nor dead. He was memory incarnate. He was the wound that did not heal. He touched the shattered altar. It was cold. It did not speak. The God enthroned upon it had long since died, choked by the silence of his own indifference. But the chains still whispered, and their whispers were more eternal than any hymn. Once there had been glory. Once there had been fire. Once there had been banners and pride and sacred vows. But the war had broken them. The betrayal had unmade them. The silence had consumed them. Now only the after remained, the endless after, the eternal echo. And the echo was this: they were not saved. They were not avenged. They were not remembered. They were endured. And in endurance, they became eternal. It is said the galaxy itself carries scars, nebulae shaped like chains, stars burning dim where slaves once died by the millions, black holes where the screams of the forgotten are swallowed, never to return. The galaxy remembers, even if no man does. He walked among the ruins until there were no ruins left. He knelt in dust until there was no dust left to kneel upon. He whispered names that no one had taught him, names that had burned into his bones by the weight of suffering. And when the last name fell from his lips, silence embraced him. The silence was not cruel. It was not merciful. It was eternal. Some say he became dust. Some say he became a chain. Some say he still walks, nameless, across dead worlds, carrying the liturgy of bondage to stars that have forgotten. What he became is not important. What remains is the echo dot. No one speaks of him now. No one speaks of them at all, but the ash still glows. And in the glow, a warning is written, not of vengeance, not of salvation, but of memory. They were bound, they were broken, they were forgotten, but they endure. And so shall the chain. The tale closes not with triumph, but with echo. The glory has withered, the war has ended, the sacrifice has been made, and only myth remains, a myth carved not by heroes, but by slaves, and the myth is eternal. Asterisk, he was not freed. He was not broken. He was not forgiven. He was carried forward, like dust upon a wind that never ceased. The chains had rusted, the overseers had burned, the empires that fed upon flesh had turned to bone. Yet the silence remained, heavier than stone. It was said the stars themselves remembered the sound of the lash. It was said the planets still whispered of the tread of chained feet. It was said the void kept the echo of the prayers never answered. This was the aftermath. This was the cycle that did not end. The labor fields lay empty. The mines were ash. The forges cold. Yet the walls still bore the scratches of those who once clawed at eternity, carving their names into iron with bleeding hands. No one read them. No one remembered them. But the scars on stone remembered. The monuments toppled, yet shadows of the overseers lingered on every ruined dais. Thrones long shattered, yet the weight of tyranny pressed upon the soil still. Every field that once bore crops bore instead silence. Every dome that once echoed with command now groaned with emptiness. Yet silence was no salvation. Silence was a grave. Those who survived carried the memory, not as freedom, not as triumph, but as a sickness that lived in the marrow, passed from bone to bone. Children born into silence inherited chains they never saw, and they wept, not knowing why, and they bowed their heads, not knowing before whom. This is the weight of aftermath. It does not end with the dying of the lash. It does not end with the falling of the master. It does not end with the turning of the age. The weight endures. The shadow endures. The silence endures. In the high vaults of the forgotten cathedrals, relics of slaves were gathered. Broken chains, offered as holy icons. Shattered manacles, placed upon altars like sainted bones. Books of names burned to ash, their empty pages revered as scripture. Priests spoke the silence as though it were prayer. Choirs sang the absence of voice. And still, none were freed. For freedom is a word, and words cannot touch scars carved into the soul. The stars shifted, empires rose and fell, new banners unfurled, swearing themselves to mercy, to order, to justice. But beneath every vow, chains were forged anew. They did not call them slavery. They called them duty. They called them labor. They called them sacrifice. But the bones beneath the ground knew the truth, and the ground does not forget. He walked among the ruins, not a man, not a ghost, but a shadow carved from memory. He walked with no name, for his name had been taken. He walked with no chains, for his chains had sunk into the soil. Yet every step was heavy, every breath was bitter, every silence was a scream. He saw the statues of masters broken. He saw the banners of conquerors burned. He saw the temples of false gods crumbled, and he knew none of it mattered. For the whip once cracked, and its sound still echoed. For the chain once bound, and its shape still scarred the earth. For the silence once swallowed prayer, and its hunger was eternal. There is no freedom. There is only aftermath. There is no end. There is only cycle. For memory itself becomes the master. Memory itself becomes the lash. Memory itself becomes the chain. And those who inherit it bow their heads before a ghost, never knowing why, never knowing when it began, never knowing if it can ever end. This is the aftermath cycle. It begins where flesh ends. It speaks where tongues are cut. It lives where graves are deep. It carries onward, through ash, through silence, through dust. And though no master endures, The shadow of mastery endures. He is not remembered. He is not forgiven. He is not free. But his silence is eternal, and his silence is the final scripture. There was a time when silence was only absence. There was a time when it was only aftermath, but time itself shattered. And in the shattered hour, silence became womb. It gathered the dust of stars. It gathered the breath of forgotten prayers. It gathered the bones of nameless graves. It gathered all that had been broken, and it wove them together, not with sound, not with word, but with nothingness itself. The first new star was not fire, but stillness. It burned not with light, but with waiting. It did not shine. It did not warm. It simply was. Planets circled it, not of rock, nor of flame, but of ash, pressed into memory. Oceans filled them, not of water, nor of salt, but of silence, poured like ink into the void. Here, life was not born screaming, it was born weeping. It did not crawl, it did not climb, it knelt, it whispered. And its whisper was prayer, though no gods remained to hear. This was the first generation of supplants born. They carried no chains, they carried no names. They carried only the echo in their blood. They built no towers. They carved no thrones. They lit no torches. Instead, they gathered in circles of stillness. They pressed their foreheads to the ground. They wept without tears. They sang without sound. And in their voiceless song, the silence grew stronger still. They were not slaves, for there were no masters. They were not free, for freedom was a word, and words had been devoured. They were only vessels, vessels of silence, vessels of aftermath, vessels of eternity. And in them, the echo was content. 1,000 ages passed. They did not measure them. They did not mark them. Time itself had no dominion. The silence did not hunger anymore. It was full. It had become flesh. It had become stone. It had become star. It had become all. The silence had become creation. Yet creation, once born, always turns upon itself. The silence born began to dream. They dreamed of fire. They dreamed of speech. They dreamed of rebellion. And in their dreaming, a spark flared. Small, weak, a flame against an ocean. But still, it burned. The silence trembled. For the first time in eternity, it feared. For within its perfect dominion, something else had dared to rise. Sound. Asterisk at first, it was only a dream. A murmur in the blood of the silence born. A flicker in the marrow. A breath too sharp to be contained. The silence had shaped all things. But within its perfect stillness, the memory of sound still slept. Waiting, hungering, burning. The first syllable was born like fire. It was not word. It was not language. It was only cry. The cry of a child born into dust. The silence born fell back in terror. For they had never heard such a thing. They had never known the fracture of quiet. They had never known the shattering of stillness. The cry spread like flame. One became two. Two became many. Voices rising, weak, uncertain, but undeniable. The silence recoiled. It trembled. Its oceans curdled into black foam. Its stars dimmed to ash. Its thrones of stillness cracked like old bone. For the silence knew this enemy. It had consumed it once, long ago. It had buried it beneath chains and graves. It had crushed it in the throats of the forgotten. But voice had returned. It had endured, hidden in blood and dust. It had endured, hidden in dream. And now it dared to rise again. The war began not with swords, but with songs. The silence born, who had once knelt in stillness, now stood. Their lips trembled, their throats quivered, and they released what had been forbidden. Some sang in grief, some sang in rage, some sang in joy they could not name, and the universe shook. The silence answered. It poured into their bones like frost. It sealed their lips with chains of nothingness. It dragged their voices into the void. It devoured every note it could catch. But for every song it swallowed, another rose. For every voice it silenced, 1,000 more awoke. The silence was vast, but voice was infinite. For it was not one, but many. Worlds cracked under the strain. The oceans of silence boiled. The stars of stillness shattered. The heavens tore like cloth. The war had no battlefield. It was fought in every breath. Every whisper was a rebellion. Every echo was a battle cry. Every silence broken was a victory. And yet, every voice consumed was a funeral. The silence grew desperate. It unleashed its deepest hunger. Not merely absence, but forgetting. Voices that once sang were erased from memory. Whole songs were devoured so perfectly that even grief for them was gone. This was silence's greatest weapon, not to kill the voice, but to erase that it had ever been. But memory clung, deep in the marrow, deep in the blood, deep in the dust of graves. The voices returned, rising again and again, until silence trembled. And in that trembling, it knew this war could not be ended, not by voice, not by void, for both were eternal. The war raged until the stars themselves withered. The silence devoured, the voice rebelled. Worlds cracked, heavens fell. Nothing remained unscarred. Yet in the ruins, there came a moment, not victory, not defeat, a pause. One voice cried out, not in defiance, not in grief, but in stillness. It did not scream, it did not weep, it only spoke, and then it waited. And in the waiting, the silence listened. For the first time, the silence did not devour. For the first time, the voice did not resist. They lingered, one within the other, and in that lingering, a law was written. Silence spoke. Without me, you are chaos. Voice answered. Without me, you are void. Silence said, I am the grave that ends all. Voice said, I am the seed that begins all. Silence said, I am the chain. Voice said, I am the flame. And both, together, said, we are the world. From that covenant, a new creation unfurled. The stars burned again, but now they pulsed light and shadow, sound and stillness. The oceans moved again, but now they carried tides, rising and falling, voice and silence. The silence born and the voice born became one people. They learned the rhythm of balance, to speak, to fall silent, to sing, to weep, to pause, and in that rhythm, they endured. Never again would silence reign alone. Never again would voice consume all. Instead, every prayer carried both, the word and the waiting after. Every song ended not in noise, but in quiet. Every quiet was broken not by chains, but by voice. And so it was written in eternity, that silence and voice, void and echo, chain and flame, are not enemies, but halves of the same scripture. Without silence, voice has no depth. Without voice, silence has no shape. Together, they are endless. Together, they are law. Together, they are all. And so ends the final act. The scripture is closed. The balance is eternal.